If you're a guest with us, we've been going through the book of Ephesians since January, taking a few detours along the way, and now for the last 7 weeks, we've been in this section in the book of Ephesians, specifically where the Apostle Paul is giving instructions on the family. He's teaching us what Christian families should look like, how wives and husbands are to relate to one another, how marriages are to display the gospel of Jesus Christ in their love and respect for one another. And then last week we saw how children are encouraged, are instructed, commanded to be obedient to their parents. Well, this morning we're going to turn the focus from children and their relationship to their parents to parents and their relationship to their children. When it comes down to who we are as parents and where we've been and what we've done, I have no doubt that there are heartaches on every pew. As I look over the last 26 years of my life as a father, there are failures that I've made. There are mistakes that are too numerous to count. There are times when I was far too strict. There were times when I was far too lenient. There are times when I was very purposeful and intentional, and there are large swaths over my fatherhood where there was an indifferent passivity. All of us have made mistakes. I've told my oldest daughter, Aubrey, on a couple of occasions, I'm sorry that you were the firstborn. That means I made the most mistakes on you. That kind of goes with the territory. What I've discovered is the 8 words I taught you as husbands and wives also apply to parents. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Please forgive me. There are numerous instances I could look back on in my life as a dad over 26 years, and I could beat myself up over personal failures. But here's the thing, there's not really any benefit in doing that. Because the past is just that, it's the past. We can learn from the past, we can try to correct the past, but the past is the past. So parents, this morning, the goal and the intention of this message is not to heap guilt upon you because of your failures as a father or as a mother. Instead, my heart this morning is that we would see clear instruction from the Scriptures here in Ephesians and related texts that will help guide us into the future as moms and dads, because there's a broad range of experiences and stages in life that are represented in this room. Some of you are in the twilight of your lives, and this area of parenting is long gone. Some of us are right in the middle of it, and some of you, parenting seems like a long, far away, distant thing in the future. But here's what I believe this text helps, how it helps us as a congregation, that we have a community of faith known as Lookout Valley Baptist Church, a spiritual family where we welcome one another home that enables our families collectively to flourish. So whether you're a senior and your kids are long gone, or you're a college student or youth and it looks like parenthood is far away, we can develop an atmosphere and an environment here at Lookout Valley where families, Christian families, flourish and grow and develop. That's my heart and my goal this morning. So look with me in Ephesians chapter 6, beginning at verse 4, and only verse 4. This is God's word. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. May God add his blessing to both the reading and the hearing of his word. It's interesting that this instruction is addressed specifically to fathers. We looked at last week that the instruction to children was to obey their parents. So Paul understood the concept of moms and dads working in concert together. Paul understood the concept of parents being involved in this process of raising children. But it's interesting that here he addresses the instruction specifically to fathers. And I think by extension, mothers are included in this, but he addresses it to fathers. There's a couple corresponding reasons I believe he does that. For one, it's cultural. In the first century, where the Apostle Paul was writing to, in the Roman Empire, there was a Roman law called the patria potestas, which simply in Latin means the father's power. And the father's power, according to Roman law, was absolute in the family. In other words, children, you were a piece of property of your father. Everything you had, everything you possessed, even when you left the home, was still in the line of the father, and he could dispossess you of whatever your possessions were as the patria potestas. Additionally, this Roman law allowed for the father to even execute punishment to the point of the death penalty upon his children. Without any court system, without any due process, the father could simply say, this child has offended in such a way that he's deserving of capital punishment, and kill his child. This was the law of the land. We know absolute authority corrupts absolutely. And so Paul's writing in this culture of Rome to these fathers who have absolute power in the home. And he's speaking to them. I think that's part of the reason why he addresses fathers. I think also he addresses fathers because here we have fathers who have this tendency, this fleshly tendency. We see it all the way from the very beginning with Adam, of passivity, of being disconnected, of being moved away from what's going on in the family, being disconnected. Fathers have a penchant for being unengaged and uninterested, allowing the mother who's with the children more time than they are to just kind of take the reins of parenting. And so Paul is addressing this to fathers, I think, in part because we have the tendency to cede the fatherhood, the parenting of the children, over to the mother. But I think ultimately, however, Paul addresses this to fathers because you will give an account to God for the way you lead your family. You will stand before God as the father and give an account for those that you had charge over, those God gave you to steward and to lead. And so Paul addresses this instruction to fathers and by extension to mothers because of this high responsibility. I know that there are some here today even, that there's no father in the picture. Mom, you're playing both parts of mom and dad. And mothers, even if the father is in the picture, you by extension, these instructions and this teaching is for all parents to consider. Paul does what he often does with instructions. He gives a negative and then a positive. A negative command and then a positive command. So those are the two commands, and I'm going to look at two main points this morning in the message. First one is this. Number one, I want us to consider the negative injunction. The negative injunction. The Apostle Paul says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Do not provoke your children to anger. Now, let me tell you before we understand what he's saying, what he's not saying. Children, teenagers, listen, he's not saying that parents should never make you mad. There's going to be times when because a parent is doing what a parent ought to do, the kids are going to get mad. Can anybody agree with that? There are times when children get angry with their parents, when they, out of their best judgment and from their wisdom, knowing what's healthy and what's not healthy, knowing what's right and what's not right, will, for the safety and the protection of their children, say, no, you can't go to this place. No, you can't hang out with this person. No, you can't do that. And the kid can get mad. That's not what Paul's saying here. Don't ever make your children mad. Parents, we have a responsibility sometimes to make our kids mad. That's what it means to parent. So what's Paul talking about here? Particularly, this concept of provoking children to anger suggests a repeated pattern where we gradually build up in our children this deep-seated hatred and resentment. And it eventually boils over to this outward hostility of the children towards the fathers and towards the mothers. You know, the Apostle Paul also wrote to the church in Colossae, very parallel commands and instructions. I love the way he put it in Colossians chapter 3, a similar instruction. He says, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. Isn't that interesting? That this provocation, this irritation can bring about in the children this great discouragement. There is great potential in the way of fathers, in the way of mothers, to bring about a discouragement, a disheartening in the children God has given them to raise. The word here, provoke to anger, is translated that way in the ESV, in the NIV, and in other translations, it's translated exasperate. Exasperate. The definition of exasperate is this: to irritate or provoke to a high degree, to annoy extremely. Fathers, don't irritate or provoke to a high degree and annoy extremely. Don't exasperate your children. Now this week I put myself through an uncomfortable exercise. On Tuesday morning at our regular morning devotional as a family, after we read the passage for the day and we talked about that, I said, well, we're going to go quickly through devotional because I want to ask you all a question. And the 3 children that still live at home, I asked them this question. What are some things that provoke you to anger that a father does? Dads, do this with your children. It's uncomfortable to ask them that question. What are some things that a father does, or what are some things you see maybe in me or even in other fathers that irritate their children, that cause them to become exasperated, that cause them to be irritated and provoked and annoyed? And then the group of men I meet with weekly, I ask them the same question, and we dialogued about that. Friends, that's an uncomfortable exercise to be faced with. But if I went through it this week, guess what? You're going to go through it too. So I've distilled down some of the personal flaws and failures I've done as a parent and I've seen other parents experience into really 4 categories or 4 areas. How to exasperate your child. I'm not telling you to go do this. This is what not to do. This is what you might be doing that exasperates your child. The first thing is this: selfishness. Selfishness. Selfishness is just that. It's a preoccupation with ourselves. Selfishness is thinking first and foremost about me in the relationship with the child. And this can be displayed in this selfishness in a couple ways. One way is through neglect. Neglect. We see this pattern with King David and his sons. David neglected being a good father and a parent to his sons. He never at any time said anything to them that caused them to be displeased with him. He was a neglectful, selfish parent. Another way selfishness manifests its way into our lives as parents is such a way that my reputation, my name, my highest consideration is really what's at stake here with the child, not my child's name, reputation, and consideration. Selfishness seeks to press myself, my identity upon my children. As I thought about it this week, I saw this in my own life in a couple of ways with my children. When Aubrey, my oldest, who's now 26, when she was 18 months old, 19, 20 months old, she could hum a melody before she could sing, before she could speak. And so guess what I did, being a musician? Oh, she's going to be the greatest musician ever, right? I've got a musical prodigy here on my hands. And so I start pressing upon her these things. And I start taking her to nursing homes at 20 months old, 24 months old, sitting her on top of a piano bench, and she had a whole repertoire of songs she would sing to the nursing home, and they loved it. Until she got about 6 years old, and she said, Dad, I don't want to sing anymore. I don't want to sing in front of people anymore. That was a result of me pressing upon her, listen, what I wanted her to be, who I wanted her to be. And I did the same thing with my son, Trent. I wrestled. He was short and stocky. I'm short and stocky. I said, well, he's obviously born to wrestle. So I made him wrestle. I forced upon him. Now, he enjoyed it. He had a lot of good times in that. But again, this can become where we are vicariously trying to live through our children. Anybody relate to that with me? This is selfishness as a parent. Selfishness. Here's another way we can exasperate our children, and that's harshness. Harshness. There's a continual severity, a continual coming down hard on the child. The home life is dominated by this kind of tyranny. The child never knows what's going to set the dad or set the mom off. And even if there is a sense of peace from time to time, the child knows this is just the calm before the storm. You want to exasperate your child? Harshness. Overreacting about anything that's done or anything that's said. One thing that's been helpful in our household is to try to curb this environment of harshness is simply to ask this question: is this going to matter tomorrow? Is this thing I'm getting so upset about, so ticked off about, is this going to even amount to a hill of beans tomorrow? You know what we discovered? Most of the things we get harsh about won't matter tomorrow. And here's an even bigger question. What's the eternal value of this thing I'm getting so upset about? Is there any eternal significance in this? And 99.9% of the times, the things we get angry about as parents won't matter at all in eternity. So there's this harshness. Connected to this is the importance of recognizing whether or not something a child does is accidental or it's intentional rebellion or disobedience. But there's a difference. But often as parents, we can react to what a child does accidentally as if it was an affront to our position. We can react to it as if it was an intentional rebellion against our authority and against our position. There's an extreme difference between sitting at the table at dinner time and a child knocking over their cup of juice and a child picking up the cup of juice and pouring it out on the table. We've had both, right? There's a difference between an accident and willful disobedience. Another principle related to this harshness is we've got to recognize one size does not fit all with regard to our children. There are not cookie-cutter parenting molds that we can use with every child. We've got 5 children. All 5 children are completely different individuals that God's created. So there's selfishness, harshness. Here's the next one, inconsistency. Inconsistency will exasperate your child. One day something's allowed, the next day something's ignored, and the day 3, it's come down on hard and punished for the exact same thing. There's an inconsistency. The child never knows where they stand. One day we can say one thing, and out of a sense of frustration, the next day we can say something else. If we're consistently inconsistent, we run the risk of provoking our children to anger. Here's a 4th category, and that is unreasonableness. Unreasonableness. There's no rhyme or reason to what we do. We haven't made our expectations, our boundaries clear. We're just kind of running by the seat of our pants. And surely the most disheartening thing for a child, and this is the height of unreasonableness, is when a child simply says, "But can I just explain?" No! There's no explanation. Why not? Why can't the child explain? This isn't the Marine Corps. This is a child. Unreasonableness with your child will exasperate them. I told you this would be an uncomfortable exercise. You know, Jesus told a lot of parables to illustrate spiritual truths. A parable was a human story, a fictional story that Jesus made up that carried with it a greater and higher spiritual truth. Often in his story, the antagonist of the story was a Pharisee. Sometimes he actually called them out by name. Were they the obvious antagonists? You think of the one parable where Jesus told the parable of the praying Pharisee and the tax collector who's also praying. And in the parable, the Pharisee says, "God, I thank you I'm not like this sinner over here," right? Obvious antagonist of Jesus' story there. Another story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. The 2 fellows who walked around the wounded traveler were religious people. And the Gentile, pagan, was the one who helped him. So often in Jesus' story, the antagonists were metaphors for the Pharisees of their day. Sometimes it was a little more subtle. For instance, in the parable of the Prodigal Son, there are 3 characters in that story. They're the prodigal son, the father, and then who? The older brother. The older brother was a picture of Pharisaism. He was a picture of the religious leaders of Jesus' day. Who was the obedient child? Who was the one that always showed up to work on time? Who was the one that had all of his T's crossed and all of his I's dotted? Who was the one that never did anything out of line, who followed the commands of the Father implicitly? Who was the righteous one? The Pharisee. But friends, we're not seeking to grow up robotic, pharisaical children who know how to answer all the questions, who know how to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, but they have no heart relationship with God. And we see in that story a father who shows mercy and compassion, forbearance, long-suffering, and ultimately forgiveness to the offending child. What a picture. We have an opportunity as parents, Christian parents, to either display to our children the loving grace of our Heavenly Father or to obscure love and grace by constant nagging, fault-finding, and endless rules and regulations. But here's the deal. The responsibility and ability to parent the way God calls us to parent, to not exasperate our children, to not provoke them to anger, we can't do it apart from grace. And let me tell you, I'm so thankful for the grace of God in my life as a dad. I'm so thankful that He has restored what the locusts have eaten. I'm so thankful that it's not because I'm some wise father that I now have a healthy, flourishing relationship with my adult children. It's all because of the grace of God. So moms, dads, depend on the grace of God as you parent. Trust in the power of the Holy Spirit to have these fruitful and fulfilling relationships with your children. So that's the negative injunction. Do not provoke your children to anger. But that leads to the second thing, the positive instruction. Paul moves from don't do this to now do this. This is a conscientious, intentional application of biblical truth to the parenting of our children. It's almost as if he's providing this kind of three-step formula, even though we know parenting is not formulaic. I just said it's not a one-size-fits-all, but these three ingredients are so essential to raising children of character, to raising champions for Christ. Three things in particular I want us to see from the text. The first one is this: there must be a purposeful development. A purposeful development. The first aspect of the positive instruction, he says, don't provoke them to anger, but bring them up. Bring them up. That word there for bring them up, it means to nourish. It has to do with feeding, giving someone something to eat. In fact, this word that's used here for bring them up is only used one other instance in the entire Bible, and it's used in this section, Ephesians. You look up your eyes to chapter 5, verse 29, Paul says, for no one ever hated his own body, but what? Nourishes and cherishes it. That's the same word, exact same word. Paul says you nourish your own body, husbands, and you also you bring up your children. This is really from the realm of agriculture, which I know a thing or two about agriculture. Growing up on a commercial hog operation, the largest hog farm in the state of Florida, because there were only 5 of them, but we produced a lot of pigs. And for a series of my adult life, for about 5 years, I was the primary feed maker for pigs. Just to tell you how many pigs we had, we had a feed mill on our farm. I made over 100 tons of feed every week. That's a lot of grain, 100% grain. It's also a lot of manure they produce, but that's another story. And with this 100 tons of feed, I would grind and mix. We had about a dozen different rations. We were always reading magazines and articles and journals to find out the best way to raise hogs. No slop, no junk. This was all corn and soybeans and high-quality grain feed. And so we learned, and we would run test cases, what worked best with different animals in different stages of their growth and how you could provide different additives and amino acids and lysine and all kinds of things. And so I had about a dozen different recipes for feed based upon the different stage of growth that these piglets were in. That's why on our farm, a piglet would be born at 2.5 pounds and would hit market weight at 250 pounds in 5.5 months. All muscle they're putting on. It's genetics and it's nutrition. There's great care. There's great tenderness. And this word here for nourish even has this tender aspect to it, this gentleness to it. It's almost like a gardener. You know, if you're a gardener and you want a quality garden, the types of fertilizers and things you need to put on the soil, the weeds you need to remove from the soil so they don't take up the necessary nutrients for the plants you're growing, the amount of sunlight you need, the type of water you need. There is great care and tenderness. How much more, friends, should we give towards our children? Great care and tenderness and gentleness to see that they're nourished physically, but even more than that, spiritually and emotionally. So first, Paul says there's a purposeful development of our children. Secondly, there's a preserving discipline of our children. There is a preserving discipline of our children. And the strong sentiment of this word here for discipline includes even punishment. Pontius Pilate used this exact same word that Paul uses here for discipline when he said in Luke 23 of Jesus, I will punish and release him. Now, there's a sense of punishment here. It's punitive, it's discipline, it's corrective. And probably the most extensive use of this word for discipline is actually in Hebrews chapter 12. Look on the screen at Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 7. This is speaking of the Lord's discipline of his children, and he's using the metaphor of fathers' discipline of their children. It says, it is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Beside this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. There must be, and this is a positive instruction here, there must be discipline of children. There's discipline involved. Now again, we talked about earlier, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are different discipline tools in our toolbox which we use that are more effective in different children than others. And the reason behind our discipline, listen, is so that we can create in our children self-discipline. Don't miss that. The reason you discipline your child is to create in them self-discipline. I think it's helpful maybe to talk a little bit about spanking here, because spanking is in the Bible. Spanking is presented for us as parents as an appropriate form of discipline. It's not the only form of discipline, but it is one in the toolbox. And I know there's a lot of misinformation about spanking, particularly how it should be carried out, how it should be done. And so I want to I've been a dad for 26 years, and I'm going to give you a practice that I've employed for the better part of 20 years with my children, particularly with regard to spanking. I've created this acrostic. The acrostic is voila, W-A-L-A. Voila. Here's how you spank your child, all right? Voila. W, wait. Wait. Give yourself a pause after the infraction of the child before you execute the spanking. And I'm speaking here particularly of children that have the capacity to understand cause and consequence. With a 12-month-old who doesn't have that capacity, when they reach for the candle, it's altogether appropriate to smack the hand so they associate the pain with the action. But I'm talking about children who have the capacity to understand cause and consequence, all right? First principle, wait. What does that mean? That means do not spank immediately upon the infraction. Give yourself 5 or even 10 minutes pause before spanking, which completely cuts out grocery store spankings. Wouldn't you love it if everybody believed this? Because they're awkward for everybody, except for maybe the person administering the spanking. You pause, you wait. Why? Because, listen, never spank a child out of anger. Never spank your child because you're frustrated with them. Never spank your child because I'm going to show you who's boss. That is inappropriate spanking. Listen, discipline is always executed so we can form our child's character and their heart. So wait. Here's the second thing with spanking. Acknowledge. With each of my children, before I gave them the spanking, after I waited, I would say, go to my room, sit on the bench in my bedroom, while I cooled off for a second, while I composed myself. When I went into the room, I would then ask my child, do you know why you're in trouble? Have them acknowledge the infraction. Help them. You might have to help them confess. Do you understand why this was wrong? Do you understand what you did? Let them verbalize their confession, and again, help them understand why it is wrong. So have them acknowledge the infraction. Here's the L, limit. Limit the licks. Limit the location of the licks. You do not spank a child until you get him to cry. That's abuse. You do not keep going until you've you're tired and you can't swing anymore. You limit the number of licks you give. I would always tell my child, you're going to get 3 licks right now. They knew what was coming. You also limit the location of the licks. God, in his wisdom, has designed the perfect spot for spankings. Hasn't he? I mean, it's extra padded with fat to protect the child from any kind of internal injuries or anything, but yet it still has the appropriate amount of sting, so they know they got smacked. That's where you spank a child. That's where you hit a child. I would also say, listen, use an instrument to spank with. A paddle, a wooden spoon. The Bible talks about the rod of correction. My mom found the perfect paddle for her children. We were at a picnic one day in Central Florida, and my other brothers were messing around. It wasn't me. They got in trouble, and so she found a piece of a palm tree frond, about this thick, about this deep, and it felt perfect in my mom's hand. And that palm tree frond is still sitting in my parents' house to this day. She used that as the paddle on me my whole life growing up. Use an instrument. Why use an instrument of correction, board of correction? Here's why. It leads to the fourth thing. Affirm. Affirm, because I want you to use your hands for something else. Instead of using your hand as the spanking instrument, you use a belt or a spoon or a paddle, because these hands are now going to affirm my love for my child. These hands are going to pick this child up as he's whimpering, and you've all experienced that. And you are consoling this child. You are petting this child on the head. You are wiping the tears off of their cheeks with these hands. And in the process, you're saying, I love you. I love you so much, and I'm so thankful for you, and that you are God's gift to me as my child. And you begin to give a verbal blessing to your child about who they are and what you desire for them to be as they grow up. Okay? Let me kind of tell you how this went down not long ago. I followed this voila process with my grandson, Carson. 2 weeks ago, we were on the back porch, and we have on the back porch of our home a bottle of bubbles, which for $1 at the dollar store provides this endless entertainment for little children, right? So my granddaughter, Nora, decided she was going to go get some bubbles and the wand and blow some bubbles. And Carson intercepted the bubbles from Nora and took off to the far corner of our porch. And following behind him is Nora saying, no, Carson, just like that. Well, as soon as Nora gets up to Carson, what does Carson do? He pours all the bubbles out. He says, if I ain't getting the bubbles, ain't nobody getting the bubbles, right? And I'm sitting there and I go, Carson, come see Papa. He walks over to me. Now, on his walk, which took him a little while, I have to determine in my mind, what's the appropriate punishment for this infraction? I determined spanking is not appropriate for this. It's not appropriate. So here's what I did. He came up to me and I said, Carson, did you just pour out all of the bubbles? Yes. Whose bubbles are those? Mine. I said, no, they're not yours. They belong to your May. That's what they call Amy. She bought them for you to use, but they are hers. And here was the punishment. Go stick your nose on the back door of the house. So he does obediently. He walks over to the back door of the house and he sticks his nose down. Here's a rule of thumb that we used with all of our children. I just used with him last week. 1 minute of timeout for every 1 year that they're old. So if they're 3 years old, how long is that? 3 minutes, right? Which for a 3-year-old is eternity, okay? So 3 minutes, he's got his nose to the door, okay? Then he comes back. I say, okay, Carson, time's up. Come over here. He comes over to me. I said, you want to say anything to May? Do you think you need to tell her you're sorry for pouring out the bubbles? I said, go put your nose back on the door. I'm sorry, May. It's like that, right? See, the discipline creates self-discipline. Here's the last thing I did in the process. I picked up Carson, carried him out to the backyard, sat on a big rock, and I hugged him, and I kissed him, and I said, Carson, you're such a special boy. I love you so much. And I'm so happy that I'm your papa. And I want God to do great things in your life. I affirmed Carson. You see that? So remember this. Voila. Wait. Have them acknowledge what they did. Limit the punishment, whether it's lick or whether it's the time in the corner. And then you affirm this child. So there's this purposeful development, a preserving discipline. Here's the third instruction, a personal discipleship. Number 3, there's a personal discipleship. He says, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That word for instruction literally means to place before the mind. To place before the mind. This is teaching. This is training. This is instruction. This is discipleship. And we talk a lot about discipleship here at Lookout Valley. We've got D groups that are meeting all the time and people growing together in their walk with the Lord. But let me tell you, the first arena, the most important arena of Christian discipleship, it is in the home. It's children being discipled by their parents, by their fathers, and by their mothers. This happens both informally and formally. This happens both intentionally and just unintentionally as the day goes on. The formal means of instruction for our family, it's looked like this. For over 20 years, our family gets together every weekday morning at 6:30 in the morning around the dining room table to study the Bible together. Maybe only 15 or 20 minutes we share together, but without fail, for 20 years, we have personally discipled in the Word, instructed in the Word, our children. As long as you live at home, Trent's 21. He's still, I call him every morning at 6:25. Time to wake up, Trent. Come on over to the table. We're going to read the Bible together. Now, what this has looked like in our family is when Aubrey and Ashley were very young, it was very, very simple. We used different devotionals. One's called Keys for Kids, and throughout the course of these last 20 years, we've memorized the Westminster Catechism. We've memorized whole chapters in the Bible. One year, we read through the Bible from cover to cover from a Bible reading plan. We do other Bible reading plans and devotionals. But listen, you must raise your children in the instruction of the Lord. You must, parents, be the first discipler of your children in a systematic, regular way. Like the instruction to the people of God in Deuteronomy chapter 6 is an altogether appropriate model to follow. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning of verse 6. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. And here's the thing with the discipling relationship. You can't take somebody in a discipling relationship where you've not already been. You can't disciple your children to a place where you're not already at. So that means study to show yourselves approved in the Word of God. Part of that personal discipleship, and certainly I believe this is the case because Paul is writing to a church, involves and includes being a part of a covenant community, being a part of a spiritual family like this church. That's why for the life of me, I do not understand how professing Christian families can go months without ever bringing their children to church, but would never miss a ball game. Does that make sense? We have a responsibility, and especially as our culture becomes less and less comfortable for Christians, which in a lot of ways is a good thing, we must be intentional about the discipling of our children. Your child's spiritual development is infinitely more important than their athletic development. Infinitely more important. The bottom line is this, as we close. This entire verse of how we are to be parenting our children is qualified by the last three words. Bring them up in the discipline and in the instruction of the Lord, of the Lord. When the Apostle Paul uses this word Lord, kurios in the Greek, he has an exalted understanding of this word Lord. He has an exalted meaning. We can see that in Philippians chapter 2. I have that on your outline. Philippians 2, 9 through 11 says, "Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. What does that mean? In the words of Kanye West, Jesus is king. Jesus is king. What does that mean? He rules. He reigns. He's the ruler over everything. And this is not just generally Jesus is the king of the universe. He is. This is not just specifically Jesus is the king of the church. He is. He's the senior pastor of Lookout Valley Baptist Church. Jesus is the Lord of our lives. And as the Lord, as the king, as the ruler of our lives, that means we submit everything in our lives to him first and foremost, and that includes our children. Jesus is king. And so to bring up your children with Jesus as king, to bring up your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, the kurios, is to raise them to know that in everything we look for the lordship of Jesus Christ here. We look for the purpose of Christ. Bringing them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord lets them know that when we sin, and we all sin, we are on a pathway of death and destruction. But that pathway of death and destruction has been detoured and rerouted by Christ. Because Jesus Christ, who never sinned, who never disobeyed his parents, took our punishment, our spanking in our place. Bringing up your children to know Jesus as Lord is knowing that he died in your place, has been gloriously resurrected, ascended on high, and he now sits at the right hand of the Father ruling over the cosmos. Bringing up your children to know that he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords is to know that Christ is coming back again. And he's going to make the crooked path straight. He's going to restore everything that's been lost. Where there is neglect and abuse and injustice, Jesus the King will bring justice. And all who have repented and surrendered to him and to his rule will reign with him gloriously forever. And so, as Christian parents, bringing up our children in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord, it means setting before our children these truths. There is no sacrifice too great for the King. Raising your children up to see Jesus as Lord means them understanding there is no risk for the kingdom that is too fantastic. I will do anything for the King. Raising your children up to see Jesus as Lord means the goings-on around us are completely insignificant and inconsequential. And all that matters is the glory and the greatness of our God. Seeing Jesus as King is an exciting vision for parents because we live in a day and age when we don't see the greatness and glory of God on display. But we're called as parents to raise the gaze of our children from the here and now so that our homes can be a hospital where our children are healed. Our homes can be a fortress where our children are protected. But ultimately, our homes, Christians, must be a spiritual boot camp where we are looking to launch our children out as foot soldiers for the kingdom. That the greatest and highest goal we can have for our children is not that they would be a great musician or not that they would be a wonderful athlete, but that they would serve Christ with their whole heart and their whole life. So have your children not look upon the here and now, but upon the glory of the lordship of Jesus and his kingdom that is advancing forward. And that leads to my last thought. As Christian parents, we are called to lead our children to hope in the triumph of God and to find their significance solely in the cause of Christ. Their significance is not found in any other achievement. As Christian parents, we recognize their significance is only found in the cause of Christ. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.